If you agree that respect should be earned by courage, not age, make sure to like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Because today's story begins with a shattered silence on a quiet military base. Long before anyone knew, a 28-year-old Delta Force captain was about to humble an entire room of doubters. The teaser of it all started weeks earlier, when a storm rolled through the base hospital and knocked out half the lights. A janitor, making his rounds, pushed open a supply room door and found a dusty metal footlocker tucked behind expired medical crates. No one knew who it belonged to. No nameplate, no tags. Just a faded stencil on the lid, barely readable under the grime. Property of U.S. Army Special Operations. When they pried it open, expecting old uniforms or forgotten gear, what they found instead were commendation letters signed by commanders long since retired, mission logs stamped classified, and a medal so rarely awarded that 2 officers had to double-check it against archival photos to confirm it was real. That discovery triggered a quiet audit of personnel records that eventually revealed the storage room had belonged to a former operator, someone who had walked through the military unnoticed, uncelebrated, unspoken about for decades. And the truth of that silence would become the invisible thread linking past and present, stitching its way straight to the young woman stepping into the briefing room on that cold Tuesday morning. Captain Aria Lawson, barely 28, hair pulled back so tightly it looked forged from discipline itself, pushed open the door and walked into the Joint Operations Command Center, where a table filled with silver-haired officers froze mid-conversation the moment they saw her. Not because she was early, not because she wasn't expected, but because none of them could reconcile the rank on her uniform with the youth on her face. One colonel whispered, "She looks like an intern." Another smirked and muttered, "Babysitting duty today, huh?" And though Arya heard them, every syllable dipped in condescension, she didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't even blink. She simply walked to the board, placed her folder down, and waited for the meeting to start. That was the thing about Arya Lawson. She never needed noise to prove she belonged. But the room around her had never learned that kind of quiet. A lieutenant cleared his throat and asked, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Captain, are you sure you're supposed to be in this room? This briefing is for senior leadership." As if her uniform was decoration. As if her years embedded in Tier 1 units as a tactical analyst and ground team strategist were luck. As if she hadn't completed operations these same men only read about in restricted reports. She remained steady, replying only, "Yes, sir. I was called here to advise on the target extraction." But the snickers didn't fade. They grew, especially when General Harlow entered, stern, respected, carved out of decades of combat, and nodded at her respectfully as he took his seat. That single nod ignited the quiet irritation simmering across the table. How could this young captain have earned the kind of acknowledgement they still chased? Yet none of them knew Arya's full history. None knew that her father had been that forgotten operator whose footlocker had just been discovered, an unsung hero who had vanished from public records because his missions were buried under layers of silence thicker than the dust that covered his medals. Arya didn't speak of him. Not then. Not ever. She carried his legacy the way he taught her, not in words, but in work. And today, that work was about to dismantle every assumption in that room. The meeting opened with a digital map flashing red across the wall. Enemy movement, border shifts, intercepted communications, all pointing to an escalating threat. Colonel Reeves, gray and rigid, launched into his mission plan, a standard breach and clear that looked like it had been copied from a textbook written 20 years ago. Arya reviewed it quietly as he spoke, her fingers tightening slightly on the folder when she realized something was wrong, dangerously wrong. The colonel's plan failed to account for the terrain shift logged in the last intel drop, the one she had reviewed at dawn while half the room was still in bed. The enemy wasn't retreating, they were repositioning, forming a V-shaped trap designed to collapse on any American team approaching from the west corridor. Reeves didn't see it. None of them did. And as he droned on, confident and outdated, Arya could feel the clock ticking down on a disaster that hadn't happened yet, but soon would. When he finally finished, the general asked if there were questions. The room stayed silent. No one wanted to challenge the senior officer. No one except the 28-year-old woman they had written off before she even opened her mouth. Arya stood, steady and unshaken, and said, "Sir, permission to speak." The mission plan is fatally flawed. The temperature in the room shifted. Chairs creaked. Brows lifted. Reeves scoffed. Bold words from someone who wasn't even commissioned when half of us were running combat ops. Arya didn't react. She tapped the tablet in her hand, projecting satellite overlays on the board. The enemy isn't withdrawing. They're tightening formation. If you follow this plan, your entry team will be trapped in a kill box within the first 10 minutes. Silence. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Every eye locked on her. And for the first time, the smirks began to fade. Because now they saw it. The pattern. The trap. The danger. And they realized she was right. But this moment, this shift in the room, was only the beginning of the day Captain Arya Lawson would make every single one of them rethink everything they believed about rank, age, and who truly deserved to lead. The room stayed frozen for a long, brittle moment after Captain Arya Lawson exposed the fatal flaw in the mission plan, the glowing red map washing across the stunned faces of men who just minutes earlier dismissed her as a child playing soldier. But the silence didn't intimidate her, it sharpened her. Colonel Reeves blinked hard, jaw twitching as he searched for a rebuttal, but the data made arguments impossible. The enemy formation, the terrain funnel, the choke point. It all aligned with her analysis, and everyone saw it. General Harlow leaned forward, fingers steepled, his expression giving nothing away as he asked, "Captain Lawson, if the current plan leads to a kill box, then what would you recommend?" It was the first time anyone in that room had invited her mind into the conversation, and she didn't waste a second. She stepped to the board, swiped the map clean, and began reconstructing the battlefield from scratch with calm, precise strokes, her voice steady as she layered drone telemetry, heat signatures, and satellite shadows to reveal a pattern no one else had caught. "The shift in their formation isn't aggressive," she explained. "It's anticipatory. They're preparing for us to come at them blindly. So we don't." She outlined a silent night insertion using micro-team dispersal, 2 units splitting the terrain under radar shadows, traveling low and fast across rock formations the enemy had dismissed as impossible to traverse. She timed a drone blackout sequence that would create a 38-second visual gap for them to move undetected. She assigned a false heat signature drop on the east corridor to mimic a large convoy, drawing enemy attention away from the real extraction path. She choreographed the whole thing the way other people solved puzzles or played instruments, with a kind of instinctual intelligence that didn't need to be loud to be undeniable. As she spoke, the officers who had mocked her minutes earlier found themselves leaning in, eyes narrowing not with disbelief anymore, but with reluctant respect. Reeves, however, wasn't done fighting. "This is reckless," he snapped. "Terrain masking at night? Dispersed entry teams? You want to gamble an entire squad on a theory?" Arya turned her gaze to him, calm but razor sharp. "Sir, it's not a theory. It's data. Patterns don't guess, they reveal. And everything in the last 6 hours of intel tells us they're expecting a frontal assault. If we give them anything close to predictable, we lose people." Her tone wasn't argumentative. It was factual, uncharged, unwavering. And that quiet confidence made her words heavier than shouting ever could. The general watched her closely, seeing what the others didn't. The subtle imprint of experience in her posture, the kind carried by operators who knew the cost of miscalculated orders. "Walk me through the extraction path," he said, and she did, detailing every step, every risk, and every contingency, thinking 3 layers deep into worst-case scenarios, predicting enemy reactions before they happened. She even identified a narrow ravine that offered a natural sound barrier for the team's approach, something the automated mapping systems had overlooked. When she finished, the room was silent again. But this time, the silence was different. It wasn't disbelief. It was dawning realization. Lieutenant Mercer, the youngest of the older officers but still knee-deep in his own ego, finally broke the quiet. "How did you even see all of that?" Arya didn't boast or hesitate. "Because I spent the last 4 years embedded with forward recon teams studying enemy shift patterns. Terrain and movement are languages, sir. I speak both." Her voice carried no arrogance, just truth. Mercer leaned back, exhaling, his skepticism draining from his face. But Reeves still refused to yield. "General, with all due respect, this is still an untested approach. We should follow proven doctrine." General Harlow lifted a hand, silencing him. Then he turned to Arya, really turned, eyes trained on her like he was reassessing everything he thought he knew about her. "Captain Lawson," he said slowly, "your plan is unconventional. High risk." A pause. Heavy, holding every ego in the room hostage. "But it's also the only plan that accounts for the enemy's actual behavior instead of what we want them to do." The tension broke with that sentence, and Arya felt the shift ripple through the room. Resentful respect, grudging acknowledgement, the kind of silence people fall into when they realize the person they underestimated just saved them from disaster. "We run with Captain Lawson's plan," the general said. Reeves opened his mouth, but Harlow didn't allow a single syllable. Decision made. Officers who had rolled their eyes at her earlier now scribbled down notes, recalibrating their roles under her strategy, some glancing at her with a mixture of embarrassment and awe. Arya didn't celebrate. She didn't smirk or gloat or rub in the fact that she had just outmaneuvered men twice her age. She simply returned to her seat, reviewed the data again, and refined the timing of the blackout sequence, fully locked into the mission because arrogance had never been her motivation. Accuracy was. As the room began prepping for deployment, Mercer approached her quietly. "Captain, I misjudged you," he admitted. "You saw things we didn't." She looked up at him only briefly before turning back to her screen. "That's why we look at the data, sir, not the person presenting it." He swallowed hard, realizing she wasn't giving him comfort. She was giving him truth. And in that moment, the weight of the footlocker found in the hospital storage room seemed to echo through her presence, through her clarity, through the way she stood so firmly in her expertise. She wasn't just a brilliant strategist. She was her father's daughter, carrying a legacy of quiet excellence that didn't ask for respect but earned it in silence. And before the day was over, she would prove it on the field, not just in a room full of doubters. Night fell over the operation zone like a closing fist, but Captain Arya Lawson moved through the darkness with a calm that steadied every soul around her. Her voice low in comms as she guided the split teams across the jagged terrain she had mapped hours earlier, a landscape that would have swallowed them whole if they'd followed the original plan. The first test came quickly. An enemy scout tower they weren't supposed to encounter stood half-collapsed on the ridge, its thermal sensors flickering unpredictably in the wind. Reeves' plan would have marched them straight into its view, but Arya's dispersal path slipped them underneath its line of sight with mere inches to spare, the kind of precision that made even the most seasoned operators mutter prayers under their breath. Then came the drone blackout window, 38 seconds of total invisibility. Nothing more, nothing less. When the countdown hit 0, her teams moved like shadows through a world that would kill them if they hesitated, navigating steep drops and narrow rock shelves with the trust of soldiers who had finally realized the youngest captain in the unit saw the battlefield clearer than any of them. By the time the blackout ended, they were in position behind the ravine, silent, undetected, breathing hard into their comms as the enemy shifted toward the decoy heat signature Arya had deployed miles away. The extraction target, a captured intelligence asset critical to dismantling an escalating threat, was bound inside a fortified cave complex barely visible through the brush. Reeves' old plan would have demanded a full frontal breach. Arya's call for something else entirely. She timed the enemy rotation until only 2 guards remained at the mouth of the cave, then whispered coordinates that allowed Team Bravo to immobilize them with tranquilizers, not bullets. Clean, quiet, without raising the alarm. It was the kind of choice that proved she understood more than war. She understood consequences. Once inside, they found the captive barely conscious, terrified, and certain he would never see another sunrise. But when Arya gently knelt in front of him, cutting the ropes from his wrists with a speed that didn't shake, didn't falter, he blinked up at her like she was something unreal moving through the dark. "You're safe," she whispered, and for the first time that night, the tension in her voice cracked, not with fear, but with the humanity her father had raised her to never lose. Extraction should have been the hardest part, but Arya's design had predicted even the enemy's panic. When the decoy signature vanished and enemy squads began to recalibrate, her teams were already moving, back through the ravine, under the drone shadows, along the rock shelves that no conventional commander would have attempted. There were moments of danger. A loose boulder that nearly gave away their silence. A burst of enemy radio chatter that forced them into a full stop for 7 agonizing minutes. One soldier slipping on the shale and catching himself at the last second. But every time fear surged, Arya cut through it with precision, guiding them step by step until they emerged beneath the ridge where the evac helicopter waited with blades chopping the air, ready to carry them home. When the last operator boarded and the helicopter lifted away, Reeves found himself staring at Arya. Really staring. For the first time since the briefing room. No mockery in his eyes, no dismissive smirk on his face. Just a man forced to reconcile the truth. The mission succeeded because she saw what none of them had the vision or humility to see. Back at base, dawn rose over the tarmac as the rescued captive was rushed to medical care and the teams disembarked, exhausted but alive. General Harlow stood waiting, arms crossed, jaw tight, not with anger, but with something closer to pride. Reeves approached first, shoulders rigid, head bowed just enough to show he understood the weight of the day. "Captain Lawson," he said quietly, each word costing him. A piece of pride he didn't mind losing anymore. "Your plan saved lives. Mine would have gotten men killed." Arya didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't even hold his gaze long enough to savor the apology. She simply nodded once. "We all want the same outcome, sir," she replied softly. "Safe teams. Clean missions. Nothing else matters." The other officers gathered, some sheepish, others openly impressed, each of them carrying the sting of knowing they had misjudged someone whose competence outshone their prejudice. But the most unexpected moment came when General Harlow stepped forward, stopped in front of Arya, and gave her a slow, deliberate salute, the kind reserved for those who not only outperform expectations, but redefine them. And when she returned it, her hand didn't tremble, but her eyes flicked, just once, toward the mountains beyond the base, as if she were saluting someone else standing invisibly behind her. Someone whose dusty footlocker full of forgotten medals had resurfaced only days before. Someone whose legacy lived not in ceremonies or photographs, but in the way she navigated the world with quiet brilliance. Her father had never been honored publicly. His stories had been buried. His mission sealed. But his daughter, the young, underestimated, relentlessly disciplined Captain Arya Lawson, had carried his lessons into a room of doubters and onto a battlefield that would remember her long after the men who mocked her forgot their own words. As the sun climbed, painting the sky gold, the base loudspeaker crackled with routine announcements. The teams dispersed to debrief, and Arya walked alone toward the barracks, each step steady, each breath calm, each heartbeat whispering the truth everyone now knew. She hadn't earned respect because of her age, her rank, or the uniform she wore. She earned it because she was the kind of leader who saw danger before others sensed it, who built strategies from silence, who saved lives with brilliance instead of bravado. And though she would never say it out loud, the entire base understood. Captain Arya Lawson had not just commanded a mission. She had rewritten the definition of what leadership looked like, and she did it with the same quiet strength that once belonged to a forgotten operator whose legacy had finally found its voice through her.